All right. Oh, I should turn the projector on, huh? So today we've got another lesson on the second half of evidence-based practice. And what we're going to do then is I'm going to talk through this more along the lines of trying to convince you that this is helpful to you in the long run, and then show you how this can be done. So last time we talked about the process of evidence-based practice, what it is. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the practicalities of it. So the first thing in evidence-based practice that's important to consider and to keep in mind, obviously, is it is a decision. How evidence-based practice works is you have what you do on a regular basis already, right? Whatever your job is or whatever you're doing in the field, you have decisions you have to make every day. What am I going to do for practice? What am I going to do with this patient? How am I going to structure training sessions? Whatever that is. So the first thing would then be to decide that we're going to look at this decision-making process through the lens of evidence-based practice, where we're going to go beyond just our clinical expertise, right, which is how we normally make decisions, and we're going to start to incorporate the other things, mainly evidence and our patients' values. Right? And so when you make this decision, obviously you're deciding first and foremost to engage in something that's new. So with that, a couple of strategies or thoughts or whatever on how to make a new habit. With this, it really just starts with this idea of consuming new information on a regular basis. When you think about it, I think I remember. All right, keep it going around. So most people probably do this regularly anyway. I mean, like if you have a decision, and we talked about this with the headphones and other decisions, you're looking and gathering information. So you're already doing it. Now we just look at more efficient ways. So you have to prepare first and foremost for all of these barriers. And the main barrier when we come to this is going to be not knowing how to do this efficiently, which is why we're going to practice throughout this course, is how can we take and make this the most efficient model model available. Right? So how can we really take this strategy and make it useful for you given the time constraints that we have? And then the rest of these things is going to be about gaining the skills and access you might need to be able to do this. Most of that's not that difficult. It's just going through. And then establishing this as part of the culture. The idea that every decision we make is done in this evidence-based practice way is relatively new. Right? The idea that we're searching out the best possible ways of achieving our goals. So there are all sorts of neat things that we'll talk about that will help you do this. The two biggest categories are going to be push and pull technologies. Most of the time, you're probably used to pull technology aspects, where you go there and you pull information out of it. It's an active thing. Push technology is when it sends you the different stuff. So the same way you can subscribe to like a YouTube channel or anything like this with all that, well, those same options are available for evidence-based practice stuff. In fact, one of the neatest things, and I'll show you how to do this, is through PubMed, which is one of the main exercise science search engines. You can set up reoccurring searches that will send you the results. So I haven't read them in a long time, right? But like for a while there, I was really getting into the dynamics and the stresses on the arm of the curveball, because I was really on this kick of, of curveball gets a bad rap, right? Where it's not the fact that people are throwing curveballs, it's inappropriate mechanics and all this sort of stuff. So I wanted to if I'm going to go against popular culture that says, young kids throwing curveballs is bad, I better have a lot of information for that. So like every week, and it's been doing this and I just put it aside, but that's none. Every week I get an email that shows me what new articles have been published discussing curveball. And you can set that up for anything. All right, so if you want to know what new research is coming out on lower extremity power training, you just set it up so each week it sends it to you, and then you have the titles right there. And if it's something interesting, you can go through. And that saves you obviously a bunch of time when having to do that. But more importantly, it gives you the reminder. And so there are these things for all sorts of different aspects within those. And I'm sure you're doing most of those now. I mean, like you probably have podcasts you listen to and different things like that. Well, you find some of those and you go through and find the ones that are using the best evidence with that, and then you're gaining evidence as it is. Right? I mean, it's no different than what you probably normally do to make decisions. We're just going to use this and try to get higher level evidence and go find that and bring it together. I mean, then there are all sorts of apps. There's an app for everything, right? So the most, or not the most, I'm going to say the most important thing like 7 times, and I'll do well, this is the most important thing, then this is the most important thing over and over. But that's only because that's what I'm talking about now. They're all equally important. So an important thing in incorporating evidence-based practice into your practice is the idea that you are incorporating it. It doesn't become your practice. And what that really means is evidence doesn't become your practice. You're still an important part of the equation. You need to continue to grow as an individual, as your own abilities to practice, in an evidence-based practice way. But at the same note, right, what you're good at, your experiences, what you've been doing for years and years and been successful at, doesn't go out the window. So this is a tool you add on. And a lot of that becomes is as great as evidence-based practice is, it's limited to the evidence that's available. Often you have to interpret that evidence first to make sure it's applicable. Otherwise, you chase every little new thing that's there. And you also have to make the decisions on whether or not that research that you are gaining applies to you. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. If you don't, evidence-based practice is incorporating evidence, but everybody incorporates evidence. It's really the process of making the decision on whether or not that evidence is applicable to what you're doing. For example, I love when like big organizations talk, right? They just talk about whatever. And because they're a big organization, they come with a certain amount of credibility. And it's really neat going and listening to what like the USA volleyball team is doing for training. Or one time when I was at convention, the athletic trainer for the Vikings came and spoke and talked about the rehab, excuse me, the rehab they were doing with Adrian Peterson following his ACL. And it was really neat to hear what those guys are doing. And how many times does that then find its way down into what things are doing? Well, that's really not evidence-based practice, that's mimicry. Right? Evidence-based practice would be, okay, I've gained this new information. And I'm sure I'm sure those guys are doing stuff based on the best evidence as well. But mimicry is an evidence-based practice because evidence-based practice determines whether or not that's best for what you're doing, right? Like working with Justin is not the same as working with Adrian Peterson. I mean, maybe AAP now because he's old or whatever and Justin's young, but no. He's still a freak athlete, right? I mean, Adrian Peterson, after he tore his freak athlete, right? What you can do with him is very different, right? And in fact, one of the biggest problems that comes is not realizing what is most needed. And that comes from the first part of should you implement the evidence-based practice findings is, are these patients similar to yours? And we will look at this with the critical appraisal process starting on Monday on how to really do this. But when it comes to practicing in a evidence-based way, you as the clinician start with being the gatekeeper on what you should do, right? That's the fourth step, right? The fourth step is implementation. Well, you have to decide what you're going to implement. Does the athlete match the inclusion criteria for the research study? Were all clinically important outcomes considered, and are the likely benefits of the treatment worth the risk? And so when you think of how we're doing this, we're going to next have to critically appraise this research. It's not just gaining the research, but reading and appraising it. We have to deal with conflicting or no evidence. Sometimes there is no evidence for something. And you can still practice in an evidence-based practice way with little to no evidence or conflicting evidence. It comes in this critical appraisal as we go through. And so if you look at this here, this is different resources that talk about whether or not excessive pronation, right, like hyperpronation, causes or is associated with shin splints. Right? How many people have heard that part of the thing that causes shin splints is you're a hyperpronator, right? Well, maybe whatever. There's all sorts of different things. There's no solid answer between that. And so how do we go about making those decisions? We'll talk about that when we get to synthesizing the research. But we can't forget about the patient there, right? So far, we've talked about evidence-based process and gathering the evidence. We've talked about the clinician. The last part is talking about the patient. And so we need to realize that our evidence-based practice is going to be very specifically guided by our patient's values and what's important. The easiest answer to this is in medicine, in athletics, in personal training, or all sorts of exercise science. You're working with a patient or somebody. And you get in the most trouble when you assume you know what their goals are. Right? And sometimes your goals and their goals may be conflicted and all that. You know, especially if you're probably coaching basketball at a you know, big time D1 program. Something tells me that the #1 goal for the athletes at Duke, the basketball players at Duke, is not to win a national championship. I just don't think so. I think their #1 goal is to get drafted as high as possible and make money. Right? I mean, let's just be honest. That's what my goal would be. If I was that good, come second half or come winter semester, I ain't going to no class. Right? I'm going to fail out because as soon as March Madness is over, my butt's done. I ain't come here to play school. Right? And that's obviously an extreme example. But when you're looking at this, and we're trying to incorporate the patient into our practice, we need to realize what their overall goal is. Now, at that same note, why do you think Alabama and Clemson get all the big, and Ohio State get all the big time recruits? And defined success. See, I think that's it. When my bet is when Nick Saban and those guys show up at those big time recruit things, they talk just as much about their success on getting drafted. So what do you think their strength and conditioning program is associated with? Right? Just as much preparing those people for the draft. Anything wrong with that? Hell no. Right? But that is a decision where they realized, I mean, in my opinion, I have no idea, but in my opinion is my guess, they realized that to have the best horses, right, get the best recruits, you need to do what they want the most, and what they want is to get drafted. So if you spend just as much time training them to get drafted as you do for everything else, you'll probably win some games along the way too. Make some money. Okay. All right. I mean, the stupidest thing that people talk about is when, big time college coaches talk about going to the NFL. That's just dumb. Right? New challenge? Baloney. No new challenge. Just sit there and make, okay, yeah, maybe I only make $4 million a year instead of $6 million a year, but I can make $4 million a year for the next 20 years. Right? Whereas, I mean, yes, you go coach for the Browns, you may not even make it a season. It's not much better, you go somewhere else. All right, but including this and really asking and thinking about what's important to your patient is practicing in an evidence-based way. What? Training? Oh yeah, I mean, when I was at Virginia with football, we had Al Groh, which is a Belichick disciple in there, And so, I mean, there was all sorts of craziness when it comes to that sort of aspect. But yeah, I mean, like people were all working on individual things. You know, there were prospects, there were people. I mean, the best example that I could probably use comes from cross country. And I use this example all over for different reasons, but it works here. So the year I was there, we won the ACC championship, and I think we finished like 10th in the nation or something in men's cross country. We had, so in cross country, you run 8 and score 6. So the way the team scoring works is you know, it's kind of like golf. You try to get the lowest score, and you know, for each place, they just add up the places for your top 6. You run 8, score 6. Right? So really, you need 6 people, but you run 8. There were 3 of them there that were like, don't screw them up. They were just good, right? And so that left 5 spots, right? No matter what, you weren't catching those guys. They're just gifted. There are 5 spots. There were 45 athletes trying to get those 5 spots. So one guy, again, just this is what he really wanted to do that. So he, in my opinion, went crazy, but that's all right. He built himself up. So he averaged 105 to 110 miles a week for a calendar year. We were handing the guy a new pair of shoes every 3 weeks. I mean, 110, I mean, his long or his high, and that included speed work. So this isn't just go long runs. He's doing sprints and stuff as part of those miles, hills, all that crap. I mean, I think his long was 160 miles. That one didn't have speed work. But in 7 days, it's a lot of running. Anyway, what was most important to him was increasing his distance, so that way he would have enough, you know, aerobic capacity to meet these guys that had better foot speed. All right? So you see these sorts of differences in training associated with the different athletes. I mean, baseball and pitching does it extremely well as, you know, in addition to that, because, you know, the elite baseball pitching development programs, the Vanderbilt type schools, right? They have everybody on these individual development plans to address whatever their weakness is. And, you know, since they're pitchers and they pretty much do their own thing, right? I mean, that's not really a team sport. Pitchers is kind of like the kicker of football, you know. You need them, but they're really not baseball players, right? They're pitchers. They're a little weird. Right? But so you got them off. You got somebody working on spin rate. You got another guy working on velo. You got another guy working on this. No 2 pitchers are doing the same thing. That's an example of this patient-centered practice. If you tried in today's college game, which I'm sure they do in high school, you know, at some places, to treat all your pitchers the same, you're going to get smoked. Right? But we do that. I mean, my bet is most of our team, part of the reason that the development, strength, and conditioning is we've moved from one lifting program to each team being on a lifting program to the better ones have individuals on their own lifting programs, right? Whether you need to, you know, focus on hypertrophy, you need to focus on power, you need to focus on whatever. That's an example of evidence-based practice, patient-centered care. Does that make sense? Disablement models, I think I'm going to skip over disablement models. Not that we're short on time, but I think I'm kind of beating this horse. Feels like I'm beating this horse a little bit. You don't really care about disablement models. So I want to pause in the lesson thing and just kind of talk about how this would work, giving an example that I did, back when I actually worked for a living before teaching. And so I used to be the baseball athletic trainer for a small D3 school in Northwest Iowa, right? We sucked. I mean, like, really sucked. Like, haven't had a winning season in like 15 years, haven't won a conference title in like 30 years, like, sucked. And it was no fun, right? Baseball's long days to begin with, and if you suck, it's no fun. So what we did was we got, or I mean, it really wasn't we, I was just brought in afterwards. New pitching coach came in, and he's like, well, I don't want to suck. So he tried to come up with a strategy. Like, we're in freaking nowhere, Iowa, in D3. Right? Nobody wants to go there. Recruiting there is a pain in the butt. So I'm not just going to be able, and there's no scholarships. I can't go buy better athletes. So his thought was, all right, let's start with pitching, because he's the pitching coach. And let's find a way to make better athletes. I mean, that's pretty much take what we got and make better athletes. And so what we did was we started with this process, and we started with the evidence and tried to figure out what was going through. And from this, what we found, I mean, the biggest problem legitimately was we threw the ball too slow. So we kind of combined this with my track knowledge and like, okay, how do you throw the ball harder? Well, you practice throwing the ball harder, right? It's not rocket science. There are different ways to do that, but the biggest problem with pitching is this recovery period. So we got to find a way to prevent injuries and decrease the recovery period so they can throw more. Otherwise, we're never going to make it. So we looked, figured out, okay, this is some of the problems in there with a decreased range of motion associated with that. Things that cause decreased range of motion are a variety of different things, right? From the joint range of motion based on the shape of the joint. Can't really do much about that, or you shouldn't. Capsular and ligamentous structures, usually you don't want to be stretching those out. And then, so we're looking at muscle flexibility. Right, so what causes loss of muscle flexibility? Well, pain, swelling, guarding, overall shortened length, loss of neuromuscular control, and any combination of these. And we know that this lack of range of motion then affects their kinetic chain, forcing the possibility of injuries with that. So how do you increase range of motion? Well, mainly stretching. So what did we end up doing? We created a system where we would screen all of the pitchers and eventually the rest. And then we would create individualized warm-ups for them that would specifically address the range of motion things, and we would then institute those. Me and my athletic training students would institute those individually with that. So every day we would focus on increasing that range of motion individually. The other problem we had to address was shoulder and elbow pain, right? I mean, these guys, after they threw hard, were in, after working out, right? That causes inflammation, all that sort of stuff. That's how you get better, but we need to stay on this side of healing, right? Anytime you increase the training effort, you're going to increase the stress to the tissues. That causes damage to the tissues, right? That's what we're going for. We want tissue damage because when the tissue damage occurs, it remodels or grows, it reacts to that force And then it goes in one of two ways. Either the rate of remodeling is bigger than the damage, or the rate of the remodeling is less than the damage, right? Make sense? With that, so we needed to find a way to increase our training effort while staying on this side. So we started to look at, well, what, using research, what occurs after you pitch? Well, luckily there was lots of research on all the stuff that occurs after pitching. Apparently it's really hard on the body. My bet is most of the stuff occurs in other things as well, but pitchers just get special attention with that. So how do you go about negating that? Well, the first one would be, if you saw a bunch of that stuff, was metabolic waste products. So how do you get rid of metabolic waste products? Right? You burn them up, for lack of a better term, right? I mean, if you think of energy production basically as burning energy, right? You go and you take and you work at an energy system that would use the byproducts in an aerobic way without going anaerobic. So we instituted a light aerobic exercises. We also had this idea of, or this problem with swelling and blood flow to the muscles. So in order to increase blood flow to the muscles, you need to do rhythmic contractions of that muscle. So we did some rhythmic stabilization exercises, as well as these repeated isometric contractions. And then we also addressed their pain, through the neurophysiology of pain, using motor level electrical stimulation, applying that on days that they did high intensity workouts, as well as the following day. And basically, all of this over here shows the different ways that you can end up releasing enkephalin, right, and beta endorphins. And these are basically like, this is how like opioid pain killers work. They release these, or it's endorphins, right? So it releases your own natural opioids. Mm-hmm. So what we did with that was very much the cross-country buildup, right? Like the body can, I mean, the way that that guy ran that many miles is because you slowly go through. So as soon as we on-ramp them over everybody on our staff was basically on a 4-year on-ramp where they would continuously do more and more and more. So the freshmen, we'd start where they are. How often can you do these activities? And we would continuously do more and more. And then the nice thing with this is most of it is not very mode specific. Like most of the time we were switching the modes up on them just to decrease boredom, whether it was weighted balls or long tosses, or, it's the throwing motion. But yeah, it was a long on board.
Where they participated about 80% of the maximal on the check rates a lot now.
Mm-hmm.
Then keep that and then just monitor the overall drop off and like have them go.
Mainly from the standpoint was because these guys weren't good enough to do that sort of training. Like, the athletes we were getting in, like that big lefty you saw. Yeah, exactly, that sort of stuff. So it's like most of our guys weren't good enough, so we needed to go beyond their capabilities. Mm-hmm. But exactly, that's all these sorts of things in the process that goes through, and the real reason for this as the demonstration is looking at all of this nutty stuff and trying to figure out what was best for us. And so this is what we came up with, this was our post-pitching program, has all sorts of different things. It's all based off of the research and the individual needs of the athletes. And so after they would pitch or they would do a high intensity thing, they would immediately come over to our staff and they would get into these sorts of things. They would do whole body exercises, these upper extremity rhythmic stabilizations and repeated contractions sort of stuff with that. And they would do that on the day that they did a high intensity and the following day with that. And that's just what they would go through. Right? And I mean, this seems braggy, but like, you know, it worked. Like you evaluate the effectiveness, right? And we started winning, you know, we won the first titleship in over 30 years, right? Repeated that, went to the World Series, finished third, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, most of that didn't affect me. What affected me is I had to work less. I stopped treating injuries, right? And started doing training, right? That's what affected me, right? I stopped treating shoulder pain and I started treating the fatigue process. And so that's the idea of how you can go about and use this in your own clinical environments. Right? Whatever your aspect is or whatever you're doing, right? If you combine these things, hopefully you can lead to better outcomes. That's the process. So thoughts. Questions, thoughts? You're all believers now, right? Like, charge! No? They don't. Pitching coach left, and then I left. And guess what? They don't win anymore either. I'm not sure that's related, but no. But and then the problem is they still have the same problems. I mean, they have bigger problems now, but. So, I mean, one thing to consider with this is, right, like this could be, I mean, if done right, this should be a leg up on that sort of stuff, because the idea is to do what's best, figure out what's best. Right? I mean, that's what everyone's trying to do, right? Nobody decided they wanted to buy just buy crappy headphones, right? You want the best. And it's how do you go about doing that? This is part of the process. All right. So today's Wednesday. Friday, right, for next class, we don't have class again. Right? We have online class. I mean, these online discussions, which are much better, I think. And what we're doing is looking at now, instead of decision making within like just a random stupid thing we came up with, it's looking at something in exercise science that you don't understand. I want you to think about a time that you did something and you didn't know why. And tell us about it. There may be some other things in there the prompt will give you, but that's the main point. On Monday, then, we will get together and we will start our first writing assignment. So our first writing assignment is going to be a critical appraisal, and we will all do the same research article so we can practice reading this. But at the same time, it's time for you guys to start thinking about what is something that is interesting to you. What sort of questions do you have that you would want to spend some time trying to find the answers? That's all you need to do. Don't get into any more depth than that. Just kind of come in your mind. I'm really interested in why offensive linemen wear knee braces. And the only reason I do that is because one of my buddies from grad school, that was his project in grad school, and did a systematic review on do knee braces prevent injuries for linemen. Of course, that was 16 years ago, so maybe it's time for an update. All right, but just start thinking about that. Now, you still got some time, but if you're going to spend, 2.5 months working on something, it might as well be something you're interested in, right? Questions about what is due between now and Monday. Questions about anything else? Anyone have a good joke to end us with? We got about 9 minutes. We can end as soon as somebody comes up with a good joke, because then somebody else will have spoken. This is a great social experiment. That's not a good joke. But, and you've already talked, so you can't. You've already talked. And I appreciate it, don't get me wrong, but we got to make somebody else talk. Somebody Google a gosh darn joke. Rudy. All right. On that note, I will see you on Monday. Don't forget to do your discussion posts. And if you have any questions, make sure you holler. Yep. Yeah, let me actually bring up a post of just a picture.